Welcome to my humble abode, darlings. Come in out of the rain and get comfortable. I have a story to tell you, and I hope you enjoy. If you do, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. For Whom the Bell Troll, Part 2. The troll had indeed realized that there was other food to be had. The town folk hid their livestock downwind from him. On nights he signaled an imminent attack. He usually left those alone, except when he forgot what he'd agreed with the elders. Yet there was the odor of horses, coming from upwind, near where the bad sheeple had been, the unfair ones, more like sheepdogs. There were other smells, young sheeple mixed with the horses. He rubbed at his numerous wounds that individually would not have been a concern, but in aggregate hurt, and weakened him from the loss of blood and tearing of sinew. The rent in his side still leaked. Perhaps he should not have used that shoulder and arm to pound on the doors of the great hall. He circled through the town, weaving in and out of structures. He was wary of another trap from the unfair fighters. He would go around where they had been and get to the tender flesh beyond a rumbling, grinding noise escaping from between his pendulous lips. It was what passed for a chuckle of glee for him. "Step inside, everyone. We need to get out of the rain for a moment and see what sort of fortifications we can set up," Hal ordered his team. "You all did well and aimed true on the skirmish. I'm afraid the fell beast's armor was too much for my saber. He hefted his axe. Bettina and I will get to him next time." Bettina poked her head inside the window of the hovel when she heard her name. The shutter was no obstacle to her determination. She was on guard duty, and would make a ruckus should the troll return. The rain should let up soon, at least for the most part. Perhaps we can set up another ambush using the hovels. The thing may not even understand the origin of the arrows. It seems these country folk have never even tried to fight it. There were low rumbles and eye rolls everywhere, but across his own. He raised his voice. "Pin, out with you. You need never fear telling the truth." Pin, who knew the folly of telling anything to the lordly class, kept his eyes focused on some engrossing matter on the floor between he and his lord employer. He knuckled his forehead and shuffled up a bit. "Well, you see, Ranger, word is that these folks did put up a scrap with the monster. They lost. They had hunting bows, not the big long stave war bows like we carry. They had farm tool and maybe a few old weapons. Boys with slings, that sort of thing. None of it caused the troll any real harm, just made it mad. So it tore 'em that fought to shreds and then tore up a bunch of the town. Nobody knows why it started picking out just one victim or two after that. Some say it only gets the notion every so often. Others, that it made some kind of bargain." Hal was unsure why Pin and the others seemed so reticent to speak about the subject. They were clearly withholding something, likely another everybody says or everybody knows set of assumptions. He was about to demand answers when a muted thump sounded from behind a small door that clearly led to a root cellar of some kind. The contingent of burly men who barely fit into the interior space of the hovel jumped up and shuffled into position to face whatever new threat might emerge. Then a muffled voice sounded. "Please, my lords, it's just me and my wife, and we couldn't make it to the great hall. She's having a baby, and we had to risk it." Hall nodded, and a brawny armsman pressed the door, but it would not budge. Nonplussed, the big soldier yelled out, "Turn the latch or remove the bar. Whatever you have bollocking the door, you fool." More scrambling and thumps, and the suppressed moans of a woman in agony indicating action on the far side of the portal. Eventually, bit by bit, the door opened inward, and a careworn face peered up at the Royal Ranger and his entourage. Beg pardon, sir. Your Royal Rangership? Has the troll left so soon?" His expression shifted to cautious optimism. "Maybe your good self has slain the beast?" Hal shook his head. "It's moved on to the great hall. The bells are tolling once more, and the singing is loud enough to drown out even the tones. The evening has turned out to be one ruled by the wild forces." Antrim nodded forlornly. "My brother Ingram and his family, to our other kids. I pray the gods and powers they are safe." He looked at the floor for a moment, indeed in an aspect of deject pleading for succor, beyond what mortals could offer. Then he snapped up his head. "We have a little food, if you like, just some bread and cheese, poor stuff. But if you'll pardon my saying, you all look drenched and drained." Hal smiled encouragingly at the man. He'd had to work on his own prejudices against the lesser classes, and while he was still often oblivious to their feelings, he had learned that many feared the lordly elite, and that fear caused people to behave foolishly and to create even more confusion and frustration. Besides, he liked generous people. Gratitude, townsmen, yet I fear we have much to accomplish. The troll is still on the loose. Even now his bellows and stomps are coming back this way. We must find a place to set a trap for it. Antrim brightened. "Lord Ranger, sir, you might try the lower well square. It's close, only 3 houses down, and then 2 up. It's killed strangers there many times. They say it likes to drink from the well after eating all that flesh and bone." Hal nodded and looked around at his troops. "That's where we told the lads to meet us with the mounts. We have got there, if the troll comes back that way." He did not need to finish. The fell beast would tear into the retainers and horses and leave nothing behind but drips and drabs of gore. Page nominee Intrepidus looked up at Groom Equus in consternation. "It sounds awful big, don't you think?" Groom smiled at the boy, who was nominally in charge due to rank and privilege, but everybody knew that in an emergency, experience would ride the crest of the wave, and then sink back to obscurity when the storm had passed, and the stories that followed would not include their existence, much less their contributions. Yet it was his place and the nature of his kind to serve. "Yes, young nominee, Trep. Now he's gone all quiet-like, for one of his size. If we listen, we can hear him even over the drips of the water from the rooftops. His steps squish and splash, and his breathing is heavy and wet. Sounds a little angry. We may have to move the beast to protect him." He looked about and scratched his sparse, youthful beard. "Maybe one of them narrow spots between the bigger buildings." A small contingent looked up when they heard the sounds of Bettina's nails and men's heavy shoes tromping and splashing in their direction. Even as their hearts lifted, they were instantly plunged down into the deepest bowels, as the roar of the attacking troll froze them in terror for a moment. The fell beast charged up behind one of the mules, who obliged it with a rapid double snap of both back hooves into the creature's shins. The earlier wounds had slowed the troll enough for this to work, and the mule gained strength from the power of fear. Even as the troll raised its fist to strike the intrepid beast of burden, a volley of arrows struck it in the face and neck, and a warrior's shout echoed among the buildings around the tiny square, and Hallroth, the Royal Ranger, and his mighty mount Bettina surged into the melee. Hal had begun to whirl his rider's axe to gain momentum and lined up a deadly strike that he hoped would take off one of the troll's arms. The monster had endured terrible misfortunes thus far, but finally Lady Fortune smiled on it. It sidestepped the blow at the last moment and managed to clothesline the young ranger as he leaned out from his mount for the strike. Bettina scratched the massive limb with one of her tusks, but Hal took the brunt of the massive fist and wrist on his face and chest. He flew from the saddle and landed hard near the wall. Bettina, in rampant fury, attempted to skid to a halt, but ended up losing her feet and slamming to her side behind the fell beast. The troll, who could have leapt onto either fallen opponent with more speed than any in the party could interrupt, paused to decide on his best target. His pendulous, slobbering lips formed a bit of a smile, of which he was capable as he settled his blazing eyes on the unconscious ranger. Here was meat and drink laid before him like a banquet, the way it should have been, the way the old ones had promised. The bells tolled deeply, and the townsfolk sang their paean mightily. It was all music to the heavy beast whose bellies rumbled with hunger. Even as he started to surge forward, a low bellow deeper than the tones of the big bells sounded, and a rippling, rumbling rang from the ground. The Soforth had been made a decision among its choice of fight, flight, or freeze. It stood frozen at the appearance of the troll. Now it decided that it would flee, in the direction of the threat, and perhaps a little fight along the way. Sally had a nice bony horn that protruded from the front of her thick, skulled head. She didn't think of it as a weapon. She rarely thought at all beyond her next lumber, and the meal that awaited at the end. Rationality aside, far aside, the great beast lived up to her name and sallied forth with an incredible display of speed for the short distance, and managed to get her mass to overcome inertia more rapidly than most creatures of such bulk could manage. The troll registered the deep bellow and looked for the source. It noted the Soforth splashing forward through the recently formed puddles of muddy water. It was an interesting sight, and the billow inspired it to come up with the answering cry of challenge. By the time the idea had formed, and the first gust of air began to rise from its lung, the roar it intended was transformed into a squeak and a breathy, sudden exhalation as the Soforth struck it square in the abdomen, just below the solar plexus. The horn penetrated the thick hide of the fell beast, but it was the impact that laid the monster flat on its armored backside and out of breath, a hole torn in a vital muscle group. The sundry beast staggered at the impact, and its momentum halted. Then it lumbered over to a nearby house that had a small garden beside it, and began to munch on the vegetables that were clearly intended for its repast. Bettina then sprang from the darkness and landed on the troll's extended belly. She dug in her claws, then turned and sprang again, lithe and graceful in the direction of her erstwhile rider, leaving more torn flesh and leaking fluid. Hal had only begun to stir. His head felt as though it weighed several stone, and he didn't consider raising it for even a moment. Instead, he took inventory of his condition. He could see, as far as he could tell, it was pretty dark, though there was some torchlight emanating from somewhere among his comrades. His nose was definitely broken and bleeding. His lips were swollen, and his teeth had been rattled, but miraculously they remained in place. He definitely had some damaged ribs, perhaps not broken, but it hurt to breathe. He'd fortunately landed in soft mud rather than on any cobble or packed dirt. All in all, he was in enough pain to know that he was alive and out of action for the immediate future, at least for the next few moments. Pin saw that there would only be a short moment to take advantage of the troll's injuries. He called to those around him, "At him, lads! Stick anything you can into that hole in his belly!" Shalnoth, who should have taken charge instead, led the charge. He carried an as yet unbloodied spear, which he thrust into the cavity in the troll's midsection. He tried to angle it upward into the chest to injure the heart, as his instructors had taught him. But a troll's heart is a stony and hard, and this one was far from dead. Before the others could do anything to save him, the fell beast had seized the aspirant ranger and bitten the head from his shoulders. It had, after all, been quite hungry. Pin and the others grew enraged and drove their heavy knives and a spear or two into the wound and worked them around to cause the creature pain, and hopefully a fatal injury or three. They darted in, struck, and darted back out of reach, none wishing to share the fate of the young noble. The troll managed to scatter several of the intrepid yeomen, yet it did not detect the slightest figure who approached from over its supine head. Page nominee Intrepidus, tears streaming down his young cheeks at the loss of his friend and mentor, Shalnoth, used a small spear with a little pinion flag of the Royal Rangers attached just below the blade to strike the creature in its mouth, which was wide open from its earlier attempt at bellow. The spear had split the fell beast's tongue and slid down its throat just far enough to make its breathing even more distressed. Equus, the groom, seized the boy and pulled him up and away from the monster that still possessed far too much life and anger for his comfort. "Come on, young Master Trep. You struck a fine blow for your friend and your ranger. You've made us all proud." Ingram wiped the excess liquid from his beard and passed the cup over to his wife, Adeline. His voice had grown rather hoarse from the near screaming of the silly song that warded off the troll. He and his neighbors still sang as best they could, but the volume had to be tempered so that they could sing until dawn. Without the bells and the singing, Tollhaven was doomed. Everybody said so. The liquid burned and soothed all at once, and with a wet hiccup that he had to swallow, he resumed the song during the part about the hero who would save them all. He doubted such a being would arrive during his lifetime, then paused to consider what life would be like without the terror. Perhaps the town would grow. It was a good location, near a river and a crossroads. Although the thicket loomed on one side, there was room to grow in the other direction. He continued to sing mechanically as his thoughts continued. He'd worried for his brother and sister-in-law. He wondered whether they'd survive, and if so, whether he would have a new nephew or niece to greet them with the dawn. No matter what, he intended that their families would continue together and maintain Tollhaven. He caught sight of Bully the Butcher, alongside the community leaders, pressed into the bottom portion of the bell tower. They were not singing properly, but they had their heads together, clearly planning or deciding grave matters. He wondered how the young bell ringers had gotten their weighty charges to sound once again. Even as Ingram wondered about them, the ringers slowed the pace of their work to something slower and steadier that they could maintain all night. The one with the hammer was already near exhaustion from his earlier flurry of blows with the small but heavy smith's hammer he had been handed. Initially run around as far as he could reach, and pummeled the bronze with steel from every angle to find the best tones. Now he sat, one leg braced, and drummed at the slow, steady pace. The sounds coming from the bell had reduced noticeably, which caused him to panic just a little. The troll had, after all, attacked the hall directly. He swung the hammer high and gave the edge of the bell that produced the best tones a mighty thump. Not only did it sound satisfactory, but it also veritably shivered in the wedged position. Dust and splinters broke free from just below that edge. With slightly renewed vigor at the outcome, the boy delivered a few more thumps. The shivering increased to shaking, but he was too tired to notice. He decided he'd give the thing one more whack and then resume the slower, lighter pace. The bell responded with a resounding tone that was greater than any had produced since falling from its cradle. The ringer found himself sliding forward and looking down in horror as the bell continued to ring as it struck the sides of the tower on its way to the first floor. The ringer shortly found himself on the way after it. The tremendous tones sounded until the bell finally made a somewhat soft landing at the bottom of the tower. Ingram watched appalled as the town's leaders disappeared in an enormous red and brazen splash. Antrim stood back, the blanket he'd set aside earlier now wrapped around his new baby boy, and the baby ensconced in his mother's arms, resting up for the first feeding. Leanne blessed him with a beatific smile, engendered by relief from the surcease of the agony from so short a time past. He's a good fellow, only those first cries and then went right to sleep. Did you hear some noises from out in the village? Her eyes shifted, then widened in terror. Antrim, you've removed the blockade from the door. Antrim grinned in pride and relief. Don't worry, love. We're all under the protection of a royal ranger and his, band, I suppose. I thought they just rode around on those big striding beasts all alone in the wild. That's what everybody says. Anyway, the sounds were likely that bunch taking on the troll. This may be a big night. The bells halted. Then the young hero rode into town. We have a healthy new baby, and you appear as lovely and healthy as ever. I think all our troubles may be in the past. The troll, gut rent open and sporting some serious internal wounds, was apoplectic. How dare these puny beings attack him? It wasn't fair. They didn't follow the agreement. He would go back to his lair in the cave just below that of his mother's and tell her what they had dared to do. He couldn't even roar properly. The tiny monster had torn his tongue and throat with its stinger, and he could not catch his breath. He managed to cough and gag and spit, and eventually to tug with his great spade of a hand, until the stinger came free. He could only hope that it did not contain some venom or poison, like so many such items did. They were launched by beings and creatures from within the thicket. His primary attacker, the one who had ridden the long-leggedy beast, approached and spoke to him. He managed to feel some satisfaction that his only barely intentional blow had caused some damage. The creature bled profusely from its mouth and nose and seemed to have trouble breathing, much like his own injuries, though not so dire. It stood as tall as its diminutive stature allowed, and spoke with a strange but prideful tone. You will yield, foul beast, or I must slay you where you lay. The troll did not understand. He was unsure whether this weak fellow spoke to him or to one of the others gathered about and hefting a variety of weapons. Bloody Face raised a blade that would normally not possess much of a threat to his armored hide. Yet if the little fellow managed to get it into his already open midsection, he'd simply have to wait for an opportunity, then strike fast and hard. He'd flee today, but when he healed, he would come back and eat everyone and everything in Tollhaven, all in a day and a night. There's no use, Ranger. It's not like it can speak. Young Master Intrepidus seen to that. Even if it could, it likely couldn't shape no words we could understand. Everybody says trolls are stupid. Pin spoke confidently now that the odds had clearly shifted in the favor of Team Royal Ranger. He felt terrible about the older boy, but was proud of the younger, and relieved that his ranger had survived his first assignment. Halroth peered through the eyes, encircling with forming bruises and swelling, so that he appeared to squint. You know the rules, Bin. He glanced around at the others. We have to offer some parole to any foe we defeat, even when we believe that they will instantly break their word. He kicked the troll in the ear. This one is certainly planning treachery. His mind moves so slowly that one may easily see the gears of it turning. He's looking for a route to escape, to attack us. Hal paused, and along with the rest of the contingent, even the troll, all heads shifted towards the great hall. The tremendous clangor had begun and abruptly ended. It was followed by the slowing and then the halting of the remaining bells. The song soon ceased as well. Then the screams began. The townfolk were in a terrible uproar, and the volume of their din increased when they burst outside of the large building and fled into the darkness. They were too far away and with too many obstacles for the ranger team to see, but their activities were carried to the panting crew on the night air as a new type of song, one of desperation, yet one that could be clearly deciphered if only one took a moment to listen. The screams changed in tone from those who had first arrived outside and realized that they'd exposed themselves to the fell beast of the dark. At that point, the troll stumbled to its massive feet and began to lumber towards the hall, prepared to gobble up all he could and carry off the extras before he fled back to his lair. It behaved as though the ranger party did not exist. Antrim, Leanne, and their shiny new child made their way to the slight, open doorway of their hovel, and Antrim stepped forward to listen. He clutched the worn shaft of his militia spear with its rusted blade and listened to the screams from the great hall, and then a great thumping tread sounded in the lane that passed in front of the little home. A wet, slobbery scream accompanied the thumps and thuds, and an enormous figure loomed from the darkness. Leanne, impatient and worn, pressed forward and saw the great shadow as it passed them on the way to the hall. She gasped, and the baby made squeak too large for most newborns. Unfortunately for them, the fell beast was focused on his great feast-to-be, and it heard the sounds and caught the smells, and skidded to a halt. It turned slowly, searching for the source of the prey sounds. Its ears twitched and its nostrils flared. It finally locked eyes, not with Antrim or Leanne, but with the newborn, who could barely keep his own eyes open so early in life. The infant wore a grin, a dreaded expression known to all parents, and the presentation to the fiendish great shadow that the tiny eyes beheld. The twisting of its body and exertion of running had caused the troll's wounds to tear and worsen, yet it still hungered. The tiny morsel would suffice for a tender tidbit. Then the parents would make for a meal. He could then gather up as many as the others as he could carry. Its snail-pace cogitation was interrupted once again by a shout from a belling sound from the long-leggedy riding beast. "What ho, foul monster!" Hal charged, Bettina straight at his now less mighty foe, the horseman's axe at the ready. Bettina carried her ranger with such a quick and deadly purpose that the troll had no time to react. Its mind had been occupied by meal planning, and those thoughts were now replaced by the unreasonable unfairness of the situation. The axe struck true into the open cavity and up into the chest where the human heart would reside. It caused the fell beast to weaken and fall. A new agony jutted from its chest. Hal slowed his mount, then circled her back to review the results. Incredibly, the troll had sunk to its knees, yet had clearly not succumbed. Immediately to the tremulous force that they should surely have ruptured its beating heart, stony or not. Then he recalled one of his instructors, reminding the young ranger in training that not all beings and creatures kept their organs in the same place. Ingram lurched a step towards the base of the bell tower, only to instantly freeze in his tracks. There was no way any of the elders could have survived the weight of the falling bronze enormity. All five had surely perished. The crimson flow that led from under the great bell, and then down the steps that led to the main floor, spoke of the sealed doom. The poor bell ringer lay atop the mess, clearly broken and unbreathing. Ingram heard and then turned and saw the main door swing open as the populace fled from the horror inside, out towards the enormous arms and gaping maw of the fiend outside. He gathered his family to him and kept them in place. He wished no ill on his neighbors, yet those fool enough to invite the troll to a supper of themselves deserved their fate to his mind. Most of the swirling mass quickly realized their error and returned to the perceived safety of the great hall. Ingram urged Adeline to reserve their place and then worked his way to the main doors. He looked at the millowing silhouette that danced in the feeble light of a few torches and lamps and shook his head. He wished them well, but knew that to join him was to court death and worse. A large percentage had determined to head to their homes and accept the risk. They were confused and at a loss from the 5 pillars of the community, the elders being wiped from existence. A few even ran out into the darkness of the hills and folds where they'd hidden the livestock. Most had it in mind to hide among the animals or to herd them elsewhere. The madness of living had literally come crashing down upon them this evening. If they could not slay the fell beast, then they must flee beyond its reach. Ingram was thinking similar thoughts, but with less urgency. He was a practical man and knew that such a move required planning. He worried again for his brother. Then a bellow sounded in the distance, down near Atrum's hovel. The troll's heart was indeed in another space, though Hal had struck close enough that it now bled from a particularly vicious wound. That would soon find the creature departing the world once and for all. The mighty form tumbled from its knees and down onto its side, its features contorted into a nightmarish image. Between outrage and confusion, Hal approached the fearsome visage and plunged his long dirk into each eye, all the way to the hilt. The creature did not have a large brain, but piercing them led to a quicker and more merciful death, and might make the thing less dangerous. He wiped his blade and put it away for the moment. His entire retinue had gathered by then. Even Sally, the Sopharth, had lumbered back to join the final portion of the fight. Her own heroics would be remembered by each of the party, yet never truly celebrated, though she earned a permanent and official name in Hal's journals. Gutter Sally. Hal Roth favored her with many treats in the days ahead. He noted the shocked visage of Antrim and Leanne, and heard the cracked wailing of their large and lusty newborn. "It was dangerous for you to come out of your hiding place before the troll was dead," he admonished. Then he leapt in an undignified manner as the troll's corpse twitched a final kick into the back of his leg. Pin noted sagely and proclaimed, "Best everyone stay back until sunrise. It'll twitch till then. Everybody says so. Only daylight puts a true end to 'em." Hal squinted at his senior armsman. He had no choice since his eyes were swollen nearly shut. "A good thought, Pin. You and Page, nominee intrepidus, see to the removing of the head as a trophy for the Royal Ranger Museum of Curiosities. Perhaps we'll leave an arm to the people of Tollhaven to hang near the road that leads towards the edge of the thicket, as a means to warn future monsters that this place is protected." By the time he finished his statement, a growing party of town dwellers had gathered near the streaming and twitching carcass. They applauded and cheered at the young ranger's words. Ingram burst through the ring of spectators, huffing and out of breath. When he saw that his family was well and safe, he ran forward and embraced his brother. Hal was treated to a painful round of handshakes and shoulder pats. When the crowd attempted to lift him on their shoulders, he called for his men to protect him. "Thank you all, but this is merely a duty of the Royal Rangers. Besides, the fell beast did some damage to me, as you can see. Let's all return to the Great Hall so we may inform the elders, and as many as possible, of the demise of the troll." In his final words, many of the members of the crowd shifted their eyes towards the ground and stepped away from the warrior and his retinue. No one explained, so Ingram stepped forward. Your rangership, sir? The elders have all perished. One of the bells broke loose and, well, they were standing on the platform beneath it. All 5 of them. It took several days to sort through the mess. Before he left, Hal opened a wonderfully made tube that contained a scroll. I have here a royal decree issued by King Levius. He was interrupted by several rumbles and an outright raised voices that complained of Levius the taxer. He favored the loudest section of the gathering, with a gimlet eye and a scowling visage, which created a startled and cautious silence before he resumed. By King Levius, the Equitable, essentially it states that the elders of this town shall be replaced and newly appointed ones overseen by a local lord and lady. They will be made charged with keeping you safe. Any agreements made with trolls or other fell beasts are henceforth dissolved and disavowed. He tucked away the scroll and handed it to Atram. Since the bells took the liberty of removing the elders, I, as Royal Ranger for this region, appoint Antrim as interim mayor until the new lord and lady arrive. They will appoint a council to advise them and to represent the general populace. The recent days had been filled with both mourning and celebration. It was a trying time for the community, since the adults all cowed by the stern gaze of the Royal Ranger. It was the bold youth Carlotta who spoke. Ranger Hallroth, does this mean that the elders agree to feed us to the troll? After the rabble completed their next rounds of rumbling, Hal nodded gravely. Yes, child, it does. Apparently the troll came at the tolling of what it considered a super gong. He looked around at the crowd and the many still confused faces. Have none of you wondered why the thing rarely attacked your herds? Why it did not attack the great hall, which is hardly a fortress? None of you thought to ask why no family members of the elders were included on the monster's menu? Unless it was a convenient loss for their clan? He gestured to Pin and the others that it was time to go. We'll leave you with those many thoughts to consider. The short-sightedness of your governing body has brought about another level of government and taxation on you. Perhaps the taxes of the new lord and lady will be less erroneous than those imposed by the troll. He winked at Carlotta and then climbed aboard Bettina, around whom the crowd had left a generous space, and led his little contingents away from Tollhaven. He smiled grimly at the heavy skull that was their trophy, as it bobbed slightly on Gutter Sally's broad back. Antrim ran alongside him and shouted, so that Hal halted Bettina and looked down his slightly less puffy cheeks at the mayor. Ranger, Leanne and I want you to know. We named our new son after the aspirant ranger, Shalnoth. He glanced at the ground. Maybe you could tell his family might like that, if we didn't overstep. Hal's smile grew less grim. I'm sure they'll be pleased. After all, it was the noise of the infant that halted the troll's final charge and allowed us to slay it. The little fellow is a born Royal Ranger. With that, the party headed back for the great city of Potassium to make their report and receive their bounties. The new father was left to stand in the lane, blushing and grinning with pride. So quoth this raven. My darlings, it is an honor to be able to share these wonderful stories with you and to get permission and to even be offered these stories by such wonderful authors as Michael Lockhart. It's rather humbling, really, when you think about it. Anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye-bye. My darlings, it means so much to me that you come and listen to my little stories. I so appreciate it, but if you did like it, please feel free to hit the like button and subscribe so you can come back and hear more. My dearest thanks to my supporters, past and present. It means so much to me. Have a lovely day, my darling.